The most dangerous place I ever worked wasn't a government building or a courtroom. It was a dinner table, the long mahogany one in my mother-in-law's Forest Hill dining room, where I spent 2 years learning to disappear. I was 29 when I married into a family that treated other people's worth like a zoning application, something to be approved or denied based entirely on how useful you were to their plans. My in-laws owned one of the largest private real estate development companies in the Greater Toronto Area. The kind of company whose name appeared on donation plaques at hospital wings, and whose principals sat on the boards of charitable foundations while quietly running capital through shell corporations registered in Alberta. I knew this in granular, documented, court-admissible detail because dismantling exactly that kind of operation was what I actually did for a living. I was a senior financial crimes investigator with the Canada Revenue Agency's Criminal Investigations Program. I had spent the previous 14 months embedded in one of the most complex domestic tax fraud cases my unit had ever handled. The target company was my in-laws' firm. I had been living inside their family's orbit, attending their dinner parties, listening to their business conversations, and quietly building a case that would eventually span 4 jurisdictions and $11 million in fraudulently sheltered capital gains. My husband thought I worked in a data entry cubicle processing GST refund claims. The cover was easy to maintain because nobody in that family was curious enough about me to look closely. My business card, the sanitized one I carried at social events, read Revenue Processing Officer, Federal Tax Administration. It was designed to make eyes glaze over at parties. It was designed to make people like my brother-in-law feel entitled to ask, across a restaurant table in front of strangers, whether I had ever worked on anything that actually mattered. It worked perfectly. I want to be honest about why I stayed as long as I did. Not in the marriage that was professional necessity at first, and then something slower and harder to name. I mean why I stayed quiet at those dinners. Why I sat through 2 years of careful, polite humiliation without flinching. Part of it was the job, but part of it was something else. The way you can start to absorb other people's certainty about you when you're surrounded by it long enough. My mother-in-law was so absolutely convinced of my smallness that I sometimes caught myself checking, late at night in the bathroom with the door locked, whether she might be right, whether I had misread something, whether the person she described, dependent, unremarkable, lucky to have been included, was closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. She was not right, but the doubt was real, and I think it's worth saying that. People don't stay in diminishing situations because they're foolish. They stay because corrosion is slow, and because it's hard to leave a place before you understand what it has done to you. The dinner that ended everything happened on a Friday evening in late October at the Fairmont Royal York in downtown Toronto. My mother-in-law had organized a charity auction for the Ontario Children's Foundation. 200 guests, black tie, open bar, and a silent auction full of Muskoka cottage weekends that wealthy people bid on to feel generous without being inconvenienced. In practice, it was a networking event wearing philanthropic clothes. She was trying to secure a zoning variance approval for a 40-story mixed-use tower in Etobicoke. Several city councilors were in the room, so were 2 officials from the Federal Department of Housing. She needed those relationships badly, which meant the evening had to go perfectly, which meant every detail of the table, the flowers, the seating chart, the carefully managed flow of conversation, had been optimized to serve her purposes. I arrived in a simple navy dress I'd bought at a Bay Street consignment shop 2 seasons ago. My mother-in-law greeted me at the entrance with the specific kind of warm smile that carries a blade underneath it. "Quinn, you look comfortable," she said, which in her vocabulary meant, "You look like you shopped at Winners." She steered my husband toward a cluster of counselors near the bar before I'd finished removing my coat. He went willingly. He always did. My husband moved through rooms like a man perpetually auditioning, and his mother was the only judge he'd ever truly respected. I had understood this about him before we married. I had thought it was something that would change with time and distance. I had been wrong about that. I found a seat near the end of one of the long tables and ordered sparkling water from a passing server. The room smelled of money and construction contracts and the specific cologne worn by men who own things. I sat quietly and watched, which was exactly what I had been trained to do. My brother-in-law arrived late. He was the company's director of acquisitions, which in practice meant he flew business class to look at land parcels and played golf with municipal planners. He had his mother's talent for contempt and his father's height, and he used both to make sure a room always understood that he had arrived. He dropped into the chair across from me with the loose ease of a man who has never once worried about being unwanted. "Still surviving the government grind?" he asked, reaching past me for the breadbasket without making eye contact. "Managing," I said. "I don't know how you do it." He shook his head with something that was almost sympathy but not quite. "Honestly, government work. You show up, you stamp things, you go home, no stakes, no skin in the game. Must be nice to coast like that." I smiled and took a sip of my water. He didn't need a response. He was performing for the table, which had gradually filled with people my mother-in-law had strategically seated around us. A commercial real estate lawyer, the spouse of a city planning director, and a woman who managed a federal infrastructure fund out of an Ottawa office I happened to know, ran joint briefings with my unit twice a year. My mother-in-law settled in beside the Ottawa woman and began her usual routine. I had watched her work a room for 2 years and I knew every move. The calibrated name-dropping, the self-deprecation deployed to seem humble, while reminding the table of her family's reach, the way she surfaced my husband's accomplishments in every third sentence while editing me out of the frame entirely. "Adrian drives the complex work," she told the Ottawa woman, using my husband's name with the possessive warmth of someone presenting an exhibit. "He's been leading the Etobicoke project for 18 months. The analysis alone." She paused. "Well, Quinn helps with paperwork over at the CRA, so she understands government timelines." She laughed lightly, the way people laugh at shared knowledge, as though we had all already agreed on something. The Ottawa woman glanced at me with the brief reflexive sympathy of someone registering a minor social misfortune. "That's steady work," she said. "Very steady," my mother-in-law agreed warmly. My husband, who had heard all of this, kept his eyes on the counselor beside him and offered a laugh at something that apparently wasn't very funny. I thought about the encrypted drive inside the false bottom compartment of my work bag in the coat check. 14 months of bank records, wire transfers, falsified charitable donation receipts, and the paper trail connecting my in-laws' holding companies to 3 numbered Alberta corporations that existed solely to shelter capital gains from Toronto's real estate market. $11 million across 6 fiscal years conservatively estimated. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the auction paddles move. The moment that detonated the evening came during dessert. My brother-in-law had been drinking with escalating confidence since his arrival. He was mid-story about a land deal in Mississauga, a deal connected to a rezoning application currently under active regulatory review, which he probably should not have been discussing in a room containing federal officials, when he paused, looked across at me, and apparently decided that my continued quietness was either an invitation or a provocation. "You know what I genuinely don't understand?" he said loud enough for the full end of the table to hear. He set down his wineglass. "Quinn here, she works for the CRA. He said it the way you might say works the overnight shift at a highway rest stop, filing returns, chasing down restaurant owners for unpaid HST." He laughed. "No offense." I met his eyes and said nothing. "It's just," he gestured at the room's implication of consequence. "Do you actually understand what we build, the scale of it? We're talking hundreds of millions in development value, actual housing, actual impact on real people's lives. And you're over there making sure someone's T4 is formatted correctly." A few people offered the small, uncomfortable smiles of guests caught between a scene and politeness. "Ryan." My husband said his brother's name once, in the tone of a man who has decided that saying the name once is sufficient effort. "I'm serious." My brother-in-law turned to the Ottawa woman. "Isn't that something? She's been part of this family for 2 years and she's never once. I mean, has she ever actually worked on anything that mattered?" The Ottawa woman looked at me. Something moved across her expression, a slight tightening, a pause that lasted half a second longer than social obligations required. She set her fork down. "Which section?" she said. The question was quiet and entirely direct, the way questions are when they already know the shape of the answer. I said, "Criminal investigations." Her posture changed. Not dramatically, Just a subtle realignment, the kind of adjustment you make when a room rearranges around a single piece of information. She managed a federal infrastructure fund. She would have had cross-departmental security clearances. She would have known what the criminal investigations program handled. She would have understood exactly what kind of files that unit built cases from. She did not say anything more to me. She didn't need to. The texture of her silence told the table everything her words withheld. My brother-in-law had stopped talking. My mother-in-law was watching the Ottawa woman's face, with the focused, frightened attention of someone who has just felt the ice shift under her feet and is trying to calculate how deep the water is. My husband had turned to look at me for the first time all evening. I finished my sparkling water. I had answered a direct question with a truthful answer. That was all I had done. The drive home started quietly. My husband waited until we were on the Gardiner, the lake flat and dark to the south, before he began. He used the controlled, level voice he reserved for difficult clients, the voice that was meant to convey reason while delivering a verdict, but the control loosened with every kilometer. He said I had made his mother look foolish in front of a federal official at an event that was professionally critical to the family. He said I had been deliberately cryptic and provocative. He said it was typical of me, this habit I had of saying just enough to make people uncomfortable, and then retreating behind silence when asked to explain myself. She asked me a question, I said. I answered it honestly. You could have been more straightforward. I was straightforward. Ryan was the one being deliberately unkind to me in front of strangers. Ryan was joking. Ryan was describing an active acquisition deal to a room full of federal officials, I said. You might want to mention to him that that particular project is currently under regulatory review. It would be better for everyone if he were more careful about what he says publicly. My husband's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't ask what I meant. I think somewhere beneath the anger he understood that asking would mean receiving an answer he couldn't unhear. He told me his mother had drafted a separation agreement. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, which told me this conversation had been planned long before tonight, possibly before this evening's dinner, possibly much longer than that. He said it was fair. He said it was comprehensive. He said it would save us both a significant amount of time and difficulty if I would agree to handle things quickly and without acrimony. I asked to read it first. He said, of course. I read it the next morning at the kitchen table while he was at the gym. The agreement was engineered to protect the Hargrove family's assets. It had been built on the assumption that my only financial resources were my government salary and a modest RRSP I'd been contributing to since my mid-20s. The agreement waived any interest I might claim in the development company or its associated holdings, which was fine. I had no interest in a company I was actively investigating, and any legal claim would have created a conflict that served no one. What the family's lawyer had failed to consider was the Mutual Asset Declaration Clause in Section 4. Standard language, the kind that appears in separation agreements to ensure both parties are being transparent. Both parties agreed to full and complete disclosure of all personally held assets, investment accounts, registered savings vehicles, financial holdings outside marital property. By signing it, my husband was declaring he had no claim on any separately held assets I brought to the table. I had been investing since I was 22. I worked in financial crimes. I understood how money moved and where to put it. My government salary had been unremarkable. My investment returns had not. A TFSA maxed out every year since the program's inception. An RRSP professionally managed for a decade. A personal non-registered portfolio I'd started with an inheritance from my grandmother that had grown steadily in Canadian bank stocks, and a handful of technology positions I'd researched carefully during night shifts. My total net worth was not something I had ever mentioned to anyone in that family, because people in my line of work learn early that the most effective cover is the one that matches what people already expect to see. I drove a 2017 Civic. I bought clothes at consignment shops. I let my mother-in-law believe I struggled to make rent. None of it was false modesty, all of it was operational habit. I poured a second cup of coffee and picked up the pen he'd left beside the documents. I signed the agreement with clean, unhurried handwriting. The call from my supervisor came 3 days later. The Ottawa woman had made contact with the right people within 48 hours of the charity gala. The investigation timeline had been accelerated. There was new urgency around the Etobicoke zoning approval. The variance had just passed City Council, and once capital began flowing through the new development contracts, recovering it through enforcement would take years of litigation we didn't have budget for. My supervisor told me my access inside the household was no longer viable. My cover had dissolved the moment I told the Ottawa woman which unit I was in. He said we had enough. 14 months of documentation, combined with records obtained through court-authorized warrants, was sufficient for enforcement action. He told me to come in. I moved into the agency's temporary housing in the annex, a clean, quiet apartment near the university campus that smelled of fresh paint and other people's work. No throw pillows, no decorative anything. A secure government communications terminal in the second bedroom and a deadbolt on the front door. I made tea, sat down at the desk and went back to the file. The Greater Toronto Real Estate Council held its annual Industry Awards dinner at a convention center in the south end of the city 6 weeks later. My mother-in-law had been nominated for Developer of the Year. The Etobicoke Tower was cited in the nomination materials. She had purchased a table for 10 and filled it with everyone who had ever owed the Hargrove family a professional debt. It was the crowning event of a year she had been constructing for a long time. She didn't know that the zoning variance approval had triggered the final authorization for enforcement. She didn't know that my unit had spent the past 6 weeks coordinating with the RCMP Financial Crime Unit and the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. She didn't know that by the time she arrived at the convention center in her green gown, 3 plainclothes officers were already positioned inside the room. She did not know I was going to be there. I arrived in my work suit, charcoal, tailored, the one I wore to court briefings and official appearances, with my CRAA enforcement identification clipped visibly to the breast pocket and my supervisor beside me. I had attended enough of these industry events with my husband's family to know exactly where the Hargrove table would be. Center of the room, close enough to the stage to be easily seen accepting an award. Maximum visibility. I walked through the main entrance and the room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something enters that doesn't fit the established order. Not dramatic silence, just a change in frequency. People stopping mid-sentence, heads turning. My mother-in-law was speaking to a city councillor with one hand resting on the back of her chair when some instinct turned her around. Her eyes found my face first, then they moved to the badge. Then they found the 2 RCMP officers converging from opposite sides of the room with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who already know how a situation ends. My brother-in-law, who had been laughing at something with a glass of red wine in his hand, stopped laughing. My husband stood up. I stopped in the aisle 3 meters from their table and looked at the 3 of them. My supervisor opened the folder. Inside it was the enforcement notice, the account freeze authorization, and the formal demand for records. No, said my mother-in-law. It came out soft and strange, like a word arriving a few seconds behind the moment it belonged to. My supervisor addressed the table and the room, clearly and without elevation. The companies under investigation, the relevant sections of the Income Tax Act, the Criminal Code provisions, freeze orders effective at 7 o'clock. You work for the CRA, my brother-in-law said. He was looking at me. His voice had gone strange, too fast, too high, the voice of a man whose mind is rejecting the information his eyes are providing. You file paperwork. I investigate financial crimes, I said. I've done it for 6 years. He sat back down in his chair. I don't think he meant to. The room held its breath. 200 people in formal wear, glasses raised to lips that had forgotten to drink, watching the most prominent real estate family in their professional community discover, in a convention center in South Toronto, on a Tuesday evening in November, that the quiet woman they had catalogued as furniture had spent 14 months building a federal criminal case against them. My brother-in-law was escorted to a private room. My mother-in-law walked with the rigid composure of someone who has not yet decided how to break, and is choosing, for now, not to. The award presentation was postponed. The table sat empty. My husband stopped beside me in the aisle as they were led away. He stood there for a moment, and I could see him running back through it. Through 2 years of evenings and car rides and kitchen tables, looking for the frame where something could have been different. How long? He said. 14 months for this investigation, 6 years in the unit. He nodded once. The separation agreement is complete and legally binding. He had signed away any claim to my personal assets to protect a company whose accounts were now frozen and whose principals were facing criminal charges. The corporate trust fund his mother had structured in his name was under review pending proceedings. The portfolio he had planned to inherit from a business he'd spent his whole adult life serving was worth, as of 7 o'clock that evening, significantly less than he had believed that morning. My TFSA, my RSP, my personal investment account, none of it had ever been marital property. Now it was documented, protected, and entirely mine. He looked at me for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said, in the small, scraped-out voice of someone who means it but cannot fully account for what they're sorry for, "because there are too many things, and listing them would take longer than either of you has." I didn't say anything. I wasn't angry, I just felt finished. The specific, clean feeling of a long piece of work finally done. I walked out through the main entrance and into the November air off Lake Ontario, cold and damp and real in the way Toronto air gets in fall when the lake refuses to let the city forget it's there. I stood on the steps for a moment and breathed it in. My supervisor came out behind me. We stood quietly together, the way you can stand quietly with someone after the part of the job that required everything is finally over. "Good work," he said. "Thank you," I said. The Hargrove case went to trial 17 months later. My brother-in-law accepted a plea agreement. My mother-in-law contested every charge, which was her right, and the proceedings were exactly as long as my colleagues had predicted. My husband was not charged. The investigation had confirmed what I had always known. He had benefited from a company built on fraud without understanding its mechanics. He was not innocent of complicity exactly, but the law distinguishes between profiting from something and building it, and he had not built it. He sent me one text message 3 months after the enforcement action. It said he was sorry, it didn't specify for what, which I thought was honest in its way. There was too much to itemize. I didn't reply, not from anger, just because there was nothing left to say that would change anything for either of us. I kept the apartment in the annex. I bought a second-hand armchair for the living room, and a plant that took several attempts to keep alive. I kept the Civic. I didn't need to demonstrate anything to anyone with a car. What I think about now, when I think about those 2 years at those dinner tables, absorbing the particular kind of contempt that dresses itself in good manners and expensive wine, is that I had confused two things that are not the same: discipline and diminishment, professional silence and personal erasure. I had told myself that staying quiet was strategic, and it was, partly. But partly it was something else, the slow accumulation of other people's certainty inside your own head, until you start to examine yourself through their eyes and wonder if they might be seeing something real. They were not seeing something real. The people who need you to be small are almost always protecting something they're afraid to look at directly. They measure their own worth by the distance between where they stand and where they've placed you. They need the gap to stay wide. You are not obligated to maintain it for them. You don't have to announce yourself in a room to be the most significant person in it. You don't have to defend your value to people who have already decided not to see it. You just have to know what you're carrying, and wait. The way I learned to wait, sitting quietly at the end of a long dinner table in a hotel ballroom, while someone who'd been stealing from the public purse for 6 years called my work insignificant. The truth has its own timeline. You just have to be patient enough to let it arrive.